The morning sunlight poured through the front windows of Raleigh Main Street Cafe, washing over polished tables, steaming cups, and the quiet hum of weekday chatter. General Marcus Caldwell, still wearing his decorated U.S. Army uniform from an overnight flight out of Fort Bragg, stepped inside with a simple plan. Grab a black coffee, maybe a bagel, and then head home to see his wife and kids. He'd spent 3 decades serving his country with honor, leading soldiers through desert heat and combat storms. But this morning, this ordinary, peaceful morning, would change his life in ways no battlefield ever had. At the counter, the barista greeted him with a polite smile, her eyes flicking toward the rows of medals pinned to his chest. Some of the other customers turned to look too, a mix of curiosity and respect crossing their faces. But near the window, leaning against a patrol car parked just outside, Officer Ethan Cole saw something very different. He saw a threat. Cole's hand rested on his belt as he squinted through the glass, his expression twisting with a familiar blend of arrogance and suspicion. "Hey, you there in the costume?" he barked as he pushed through the cafe door, voice slicing through the soft music and morning calm. Every head turned. Caldwell looked up, startled but composed. "Excuse me." Cole stepped closer, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Yeah, you. Where'd you get that uniform?" The cafe fell silent. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The air thickened, heavy with disbelief. For a moment, General Caldwell wondered if this officer was joking, but there was no humor in Cole's eyes. Only the sharp, hollow confidence of a man who believed his authority was absolute. "Officer," Caldwell said evenly, his tone calm, but edged with quiet disbelief. "I'm General Marcus Caldwell, United States Army. Is there a problem here?" Cole laughed, a harsh sound that made several customers flinch. "A general? Yeah, right. And I'm his Secretary of Defense." He took another step forward, his smirk deepening. "Impersonating a military officer is a federal crime. You know that? So why don't you save the act for booking?" A few people murmured uneasily. One man raised his phone, filming. Another turned away, pretending not to see. And through it all, Caldwell stood motionless, shoulders squared, the quiet dignity of a soldier who had faced real enemies and knew the difference between danger and ignorance. "Sir," he said calmly, "if you'll just check my military ID." Cole cut him off, voice rising. "Don't play games with me. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know when someone's faking it?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. "No, officer, I think you're making a serious mistake." The words only fueled Cole's anger. He reached out, grabbing Caldwell's wrist and twisting it behind his back. The general winced, but didn't resist. Coffee cups clattered to the floor as Cole slammed him against the counter. Resisting arrest, Cole shouted. Nobody moved to help. Phones recorded. Whispers spread. Some watched with silent horror, others with morbid fascination, as one of the nation's most decorated black generals was handcuffed like a common criminal. "Officer," Caldwell managed, his voice steady even as metal bit into his skin, "you're violating federal law. Check my ID." But Cole wasn't listening. He was too lost in the sound of his own authority, too certain that his instincts, his prejudice, were truth. He tightened the cuffs until Caldwell's hands went numb, then shoved him toward the door. Before he could be dragged outside, Caldwell managed to tilt his phone upward with bound hands and send a single message. A simple alert. Unlawful arrest. Raleigh Main Street Cafe. Uniform. Full colors. Then the phone clattered to the floor. Cole hauled him out into the morning air, the general's medals glinting beneath the blue and red flash of police lights. A few onlookers gasped, realizing that the uniform was genuine. But by then it was too late. Cole shoved Caldwell into the back of his cruiser and shut the door with a slam. Inside the cafe, someone whispered, "That man's a real general." Someone else muttered, "He's not going to get away with this." They were right. 30 minutes later, the street outside the cafe erupted in the roar of engines. 3 military vehicles rolled up in formation, their doors swinging open in perfect unison. Out stepped a 4-star general, 2 colonels, and an entire security detail, each moving with the precision of soldiers who'd spent a lifetime defending respect and rank. General Patricia Hammond led the way, tall, commanding, her presence alone enough to make the air feel heavier. She'd fought in 4 war zones, faced down foreign militias, and negotiated peace treaties under sniper fire. But nothing she'd seen in all her years had prepared her for this sight. A decorated U.S. Army general, handcuffed in uniform, seated in the back of a local patrol car. Her eyes locked onto Cole, whose swagger evaporated the instant he recognized her rank. His face drained of color. The smirk was gone. "Officer," Hammond said, her voice slicing through the stunned silence like a blade. "I sincerely hope you have an exceptional explanation for why you've arrested one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced." Cole stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a man gasping for air. "Ma'am, I had reason to believe he was impersonating." "Enough," she cut in. "Do you even know who this man is?" Caldwell lifted his gaze from the back seat, meeting her eyes through the glass. There was no triumph in his expression, no anger. Only the deep, quiet hurt of someone who'd just been reminded that even decades of service couldn't armor him against ignorance. Hammond turned back to Cole. "Uncuff him. Now." Cole hesitated, but the weight of her authority was absolute. His hands trembled as he unlocked the cuffs, stepping back like a child caught doing something unforgivable. Caldwell stood, wrists raw, adjusting his uniform with slow, deliberate movements. Every eye on the street was fixed on him. The general didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. Instead, he simply looked at Cole and said, "You've shamed your badge, officer. And this isn't over." The words landed heavier than any punishment could. Cole looked around, realizing the crowd wasn't on his side anymore. People were filming. Soldiers stood nearby, watching with thinly veiled disgust. The blue and gold of Caldwell's uniform shone in the sunlight, and for the first time, Cole seemed to grasp the enormity of what he'd done. Caldwell turned to Hammond, giving a crisp salute. She returned it solemnly. "Let's get you home, General," she said quietly. As the convoy pulled away, the cafe sat frozen in the aftermath, cups overturned, whispers still hanging in the air, the faint echo of a single truth that could no longer be ignored. Even a man who'd bled for his country could still be seen as a suspect because of the color of his skin. Later, that footage, grainy, shaky, captured on 6 phones, would spread across social media like wildfire. The images of a uniformed general being manhandled, the look of horror on bystanders' faces, and the stark contrast between dignity and ignorance would ignite something far bigger than anyone in that cafe could have imagined. But in that moment, as General Marcus Caldwell sat silently in the back of the military vehicle, the weight of what had just happened pressed on him like armor he could never remove. He'd led soldiers into war, faced mortal danger, and survived it all. Yet somehow, being handcuffed on American soil, for no reason but prejudice, hurt worse than any wound he'd ever taken in battle. And deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The cafe that had been a stage for humiliation now stood silent beneath the weight of consequence. The crowd outside parted as military vehicles rumbled to a halt, their engines growling like restrained thunder. Doors swung open with crisp precision, and soldiers in full uniform stepped into the sunlight. Every motion was deliberate, disciplined, the language of authority earned through sacrifice, not arrogance. At their head was General Patricia Hammond, one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army and a legend in her own right. She had commanded troops across continents, faced enemy fire, and negotiated ceasefires with the strength of both steel and empathy. But today, she wasn't walking into a battlefield abroad. She was walking into one at home. When Hammond entered the cafe, every conversation died instantly. The barista froze. The customers who had filmed the arrest lowered their phones, shame creeping into their faces. Even Officer Ethan Cole, who only moments ago had strutted like a conqueror, went pale. His badge gleamed no brighter than the sweat breaking across his forehead. Hammond's gaze found him immediately. Her presence carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume to command silence. "Officer," she said, her tone steady but sharp enough to draw blood, I sincerely hope you have an exceptional explanation for why you've arrested one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. Cole blinked rapidly, words stumbling from his mouth like broken glass. Ma'am, I had reason to believe he was impersonating an officer. Impersonating? She interrupted, her voice like distant thunder. Do you have any idea who this man is? Her hand gestured toward Marcus Caldwell, who now stood beside her, free but still dignified, his wrists red from the cuffs. The ribbons and medals across his chest told a story that no accusation could erase. Bronze Star, Silver Star, Distinguished Service Medal, each one a testament written in courage, not assumption. Hammond turned her full attention back to Cole, who looked smaller by the second. You handcuffed a decorated general. In uniform. In public. Without cause. Her words hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot. The other officers who had arrived on scene shifted uneasily. The civilians outside peered through the windows, phones raised, capturing every frame of this reversal. Uncuff him, she ordered. Cole hesitated for a fraction too long, a mistake that deepened the silence. Then, with trembling fingers, he stepped forward and removed the cuffs. The metallic click seemed to reverberate through the entire room. Caldwell rubbed his wrists, his composure unshaken. He looked at Cole, not with rage, but with a calmness that was somehow more devastating. You've disgraced your badge, he said quietly. You'll answer for it. Hammond nodded once to Caldwell. Let's go, General. You don't belong in a place like this. As the soldiers escorted him out, cameras followed, and whispers turned into murmurs of outrage. The power dynamic that had once been so lopsided was now fully inverted. The man who had been treated like a criminal walked free under the protection of his own command, while the officer who had humiliated him stood alone, surrounded by his own shame. When the military convoy pulled away from the curb, a strange silence lingered, the kind that comes when truth collides with arrogance. Inside the cafe, Officer Cole stared at the empty doorway, the weight of his mistake pressing harder than any chain of command ever had. He had wanted to remind someone who was in charge. Now he knew. When the arrest report reached the FBI's regional office in Charlotte, it landed on the desk of Special Agent Nathan Hayes, a man whose instincts had been sharpened by 15 years of watching the justice system bend under the weight of its own hypocrisy. He'd seen corrupt cops, manipulated evidence, and buried complaints that never saw daylight. But even with all that, something about the Caldwell incident made his blood run cold. The report was sloppy, so sloppy, it was practically confessing its own guilt. According to Officer Ethan Cole's statement, General Marcus Caldwell had been aggressive, non-compliant, and verbally threatening. Yet every witness account told a completely different story. Calm, dignified, restrained. The kind of composure only a man forged by military discipline could hold under that kind of humiliation. Hayes leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. You don't get to be a general by accident, he muttered. Across the table, his partner, Special Agent Sarah Chun, was typing furiously, cross-referencing Cole's employment history. You're going to want to see this, she said. Hayes turned toward her monitor. The screen displayed a timeline of Cole's career. 7 years, 5 departments. Transfers, not promotions. Each move came after some vague internal review or disciplinary reassignment. 5 departments in 5 counties. Hayes murmured, That's not coincidence. That's cleanup. Chin scrolled through the complaints. Excessive force, falsified reports, racial profiling. All dismissed or quietly closed. Every single one. Hayes pushed his chair back and stood, pacing slowly across the office. It's the old shuffle, he said. Don't fire the problem officer. Just make him someone else's problem. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. Cole wasn't just a bad cop. He was a pattern. One link in a chain of systemic rot that stretched across North Carolina's law enforcement network like veins of rust through steel. When Hayes mapped out Cole's arrests from the past 5 years, the numbers hit like a punch. 87% of those arrested were people of color, in neighborhoods where black residents made up less than a third of the population. Hayes felt the old rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. This isn't policing, he said. This is harassment with a badge attached. Chin nodded grimly. We're not looking at one dirty cop. We're looking at a culture. They started knocking on doors. The first victim they visited was Dr. Leonard Parker, a cardiologist in Charlotte. When Hayes arrived at his house on a gray Thursday afternoon, he found Parker sitting in his living room surrounded by framed degrees, family photos, and the quiet exhaustion of a man who had carried injustice for too long. Dr. Parker, Hayes began, flashing his badge, I'd like to ask you about an incident from 2018 involving Officer Ethan Cole. Parker's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask which one. I've told this story to Internal Affairs, to lawyers, to reporters, he said quietly. Nothing ever came of it. Why should this time be any different? Because this time, Hayes said, his voice steady, it's federal. That got his attention. The story poured out slowly, like reopening a wound. Parker had been driving home from the hospital after a 30-hour shift. Exhausted, still in scrubs, still wearing his hospital ID. Cole pulled him over for suspicious driving. What followed was humiliation dressed as procedure. He kept asking me where I got the car, if it was stolen, if I was dealing drugs, Parker said. His hands trembled slightly. When he saw my hospital ID on the dashboard, he laughed and said, Yeah, right? A doctor. And I'm the President of the United States. He'd been arrested in front of his neighbors. The charge, impersonating a medical professional. The local news ran the story before it was dismissed. His reputation, carefully built over decades, crumbled in a single day. Patients canceled appointments. Parents whispered at his children's school. I spent 30 years building trust, Parker said, his voice breaking. And one racist cop destroyed it in 30 minutes. Hayes closed his notebook and said softly, You're not alone anymore, doctor. Next came Angela Torres, a high school English teacher who had been arrested during a peaceful protest in 2020. I was literally reading Maya Angelou through a megaphone, she said, her eyes red but defiant. That's it. No shouting, no violence. Just poetry. And he called it inciting a riot. She showed Hayes the medical records, a dislocated shoulder from the arrest, therapy bills, and a letter from her school district terminating her for conduct unbecoming. You know what the worst part was? She whispered. I used to teach my students about justice, about the system protecting the innocent. Then the system made a liar out of me. How do I teach them hope after that? Hayes didn't have an answer. He just listened, because sometimes listening was all justice had left before it began to rebuild. Story by story, a pattern emerged. A college student arrested for trespassing in his own dorm. A grandmother detained for disturbing the peace during choir practice. A veteran pulled over 17 times in 2 years for broken taillights that were never broken. Each case a scar left by the same disease. Authority without accountability. Late one night, the office lights burned long past midnight. Files covered every inch of the conference table. Hayes stood over them like a battlefield commander surveying the wreckage. Sarah, he said, tapping the table, we're not chasing one bad apple anymore. We're looking at an orchard that's been rotting from the roots. When they began contacting Cole's former departments, a chilling pattern of silence emerged. Some denied having records. Others cited technical data loss. A few simply hung up. But then one call changed everything. A retired captain from Greensboro, Michael Rodriguez, agreed to meet. They found him at a small diner off the highway, silver-haired, shoulders still squared like a man who'd once carried the weight of command. I filed a complaint on Cole back in 2015, Rodriguez said, sipping his coffee. Detailed. Witness statements, body cam footage, everything. He slammed a handcuffed suspect against a patrol car, so hard the guy needed stitches. I recommended termination. And Hayes asked. They ignored it, Rodriguez said flatly. Told me it would cause trouble with the union. 3 months later, they transferred Cole to another precinct. A year after that, they offered me early retirement. He set down his cup, eyes burning with the bitterness of memory. They didn't fire the problem. They silenced the whistleblower. Next came Sergeant Lisa Chun, no relation to Agent Sarah, who had worked with Cole in Durham. She met them at a coffee shop, her police career long behind her. I documented 12 separate incidents, she said. Falsified reports. Racist language. Unjustified stops. You know what they told me? She gave a hollow laugh. You're being too sensitive. Her eyes hardened. They said I was the one hurting morale, not the guy calling black residents undesirables in the break room. Why didn't you go public? Sarah asked gently. I tried, Lisa said. Internal affairs buried it. My captain warned me that I'd never get promoted again. I quit before they broke me completely. Hayes looked at her, his voice low. You did the right thing, Sergeant. You just worked in a system that punished people for doing the right thing. The investigation had grown into something far beyond Cole. It was a mirror held up to an entire institution, and the reflection was ugly. Police unions had shielded men like Cole for years, filing grievance after grievance whenever a department tried to discipline them. City attorneys warned that firing officers was too costly. Police chiefs avoided the paperwork by transferring abusers to new departments, quietly rewriting their records to look clean. Cole wasn't an anomaly. He was the inevitable result of cowardice dressed as bureaucracy. Hayes's anger deepened with every discovery, but it was what came next that made him truly sick. Dr. Rachel Nguyen, a police psychologist who'd evaluated Cole during his application process years earlier, had been trying to reach the FBI ever since she saw Caldwell's arrest on the news. When Hayes met her in her Chapel Hill office, she pulled a thick file from her cabinet, a file she'd kept hidden all these years. I knew this day would come, she said. The day someone finally asked what went wrong. Inside was a 23-page psychological evaluation, detailed, clinical, and damning. Cole's test results showed severe authority issues, racial bias, and a punitive personality type, the kind drawn to power, not service. I wrote, in plain language, that giving this man a badge would be like handing matches to an arsonist in a fireworks factory. Nguyen said. And do you know what the hiring board told me? That my report was too harsh. Too harsh. Hayes repeated, disbelief mixing with fury. They said he deserved a second chance, she said bitterly. They needed to fill a quota. White male, prior military experience, that checked the right boxes. Never mind, he'd washed out of boot camp for insubordination. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion in her eyes. The system didn't fail by accident, Agent Hayes. It chose convenience over conscience. Hayes nodded slowly. Not anymore. The deeper they went, the bigger the picture became. FBI digital forensics uncovered Cole's online activity, and what they found made the entire task force fall silent. He'd been active in extremist chat rooms for years, under usernames like BlueLine88 and JusticeKeeper14. 88, as Hayes explained to his team, is neo-Nazi code for Heil Hitler. This wasn't just casual racism. This was organization, coordination, a network of officers across 14 states who shared white supremacist ideologies, tactics, and cover stories. In private channels, they refer to their targets as undesirables. They celebrated violent arrests. They traded advice on cleaning up neighborhoods, code for driving minorities out through harassment and fear. Some even posted photos of themselves smiling beside arrested civilians, as if posing with trophies. When Hayes presented the findings to the Department of Justice, Attorney General Victoria Ramirez's face turned pale. She ordered an immediate task force, 12 prosecutors, hundreds of investigators. Operation Clean Badge was born. But before the case could go to trial, the FBI needed the public to understand the scale of what they were facing. So at the Pentagon, 3 weeks after his arrest, General Caldwell stepped back into the spotlight. Not as a victim, but as a symbol. Before a crowd of journalists, veterans, and civil rights leaders, he spoke words that would echo across the nation. I've commanded soldiers in 3 war zones, he said, voice steady as stone. But nothing prepared me for the humiliation of being handcuffed in a uniform I've bled for. Officer Cole didn't just assault me that day. He assaulted every principle this nation claims to stand for. The speech went viral within hours. Veterans across the country, black, white, Latino, Asian, began marching together in full dress uniform. The phrase, respect the uniform, all of them, appeared on signs from New York to Los Angeles. The DOJ's inbox flooded with tips, whistleblower testimonies, and archive complaints from victims who finally believed someone might listen. Within weeks, the FBI had traced Cole's communications to dozens of active officers. Some were low-level patrolmen. Others were supervisors who had spent years shielding them. It was a cancer that had metastasized inside the very institution meant to uphold the law, and the cure would have to be surgical. When the grand jury convened, the evidence was overwhelming. Ethan Cole was indicted on 47 federal counts: hate crimes, civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, and assault under color of law. But Cole, true to form, refused to see himself as guilty. "I didn't do anything wrong," he told his lawyers, even as they showed him the videos, the files, the chat logs. "I was just doing my job." Hayes watched the trial begin from the gallery, seated beside Sarah Chun. "You think he understands what he did?" she whispered. Hayes shook his head. "No, that's what makes him dangerous." Over the next 3 weeks, the courtroom became a mirror for the nation. Dr. Parker took the stand, voice steady, testimony devastating. Angela Torres followed, holding back tears as she described how her arrest had cost her career and faith in justice. Then came Caldwell. When he entered, the entire room rose. The medals on his chest caught the light, each one a quiet rebuttal to Cole's ignorance. He told his story without anger, just truth, the humiliation, the disbelief, the calm he'd forced himself to hold while a lesser man abused the power of a badge. When the defense lawyer suggested it was all a misunderstanding, Caldwell's reply became legend. "Sir," he said evenly, "when a decorated general can't buy a cup of coffee without being assaulted by police, that's not a misunderstanding. That's a system failure." The jury needed only 6 hours. Guilty on all 47 counts. As the verdict was read, Hayes felt something rare. Not triumph, not vengeance, but relief. Justice, fragile and imperfect, had found its footing again. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the first crack in a dam that had held for too long. Because for every Ethan Cole, there were dozens more out there, still protected, still armed, still convinced they were untouchable. And as Hayes packed up his files that night, he whispered to himself the promise that would define the rest of his career. The courthouse in Raleigh looked more like a fortress than a place of law. Federal marshals stood at every entrance, and barricades lined the street to control the sea of cameras and protesters that had gathered. Inside, courtroom 4B was packed so tightly that the air felt electric. Every seat was taken. Journalists from across the world, veterans in uniform, civil rights leaders, and everyday citizens who wanted to see if the scales of justice still worked in America. When Ethan Cole was led in by federal guards, the flash of cameras lit up the room. The former officer's once cocky posture was gone, replaced by a nervous stiffness that couldn't quite disguise his arrogance. His defense attorney, Marcus Sullivan, whispered something in his ear, probably a reminder to look remorseful. But Cole's jaw stayed clenched, his eyes darting toward the gallery, as if searching for sympathy he would end. OT find. At the prosecution table sat Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chun, flanked by agents Nathan Hayes and Sarah Chun. The siblings had never worked on the same case before, but this one had become personal for both of them, not because of revenge, but because they understood what was at stake. If justice failed here, it might never recover. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Judge Eleanor Watkins, a no-nonsense federal judge with 20 years on the bench, adjusted her glasses and looked over the courtroom. She knew this trial wasn't just about one man. It was about the soul of American law enforcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, "this court is now in session." The trial began with opening statements. James Chin's voice carried with the weight of purpose. "What you're about to hear," he said to the jury, "is not the story of one mistake. It is the story of a man who turned his badge into a weapon, who used authority not to protect the public, but to terrorize it. You will see a pattern of abuse, deceit, and hate, a pattern that ended only when he placed handcuffs on a United States Army general." Sullivan rose to speak for the defense, painting Cole as a hardworking officer overwhelmed by the pressures of modern policing. "He made an error in judgment," Sullivan said smoothly, "but he did not act with malice. He followed procedure. He acted to ensure safety. This was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by politics and media hysteria. The contrast couldn't have been sharper, one side invoking conscience, the other hiding behind excuses. Then came the evidence. Chun called the first witnesses, the cafe patrons who had filmed the arrest. Their testimonies were simple but devastating. They described how Cole had mocked Caldwell, ignored his ID, and slammed him against the counter while the general remained calm. Video footage played on the large courtroom screens, showing every detail. The smirk on Cole's face, the restraint in Caldwell's posture, the stunned silence of the bystanders. When the video ended, the room sat in heavy silence. Next came the victims of Cole's past. Dr. Leonard Parker, Angela Torres, and several others who had survived his pattern of abuse. Dr. Parker, dignified but visibly shaken, took the stand first. "Officer Cole looked at me like I didn't belong in my own neighborhood," he said. "Like a black man driving a nice car must have stolen it. When I told him I was a doctor, he laughed in my face." His voice wavered but didn't break. "He didn't just arrest me. He humiliated me. And it didn't matter that the charges were dropped. The damage was already done." Angela Torres followed, telling the jury about how her arrest during a peaceful protest had ended her teaching career. "He said I was inciting a riot," she said, tears welling up. "All I was doing was reading poetry. Maya Angelou. Still I rise." Her voice cracked on the last word. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Even the jurors looked shaken. But the moment everyone was waiting for came on the 8th day of testimony, when General Marcus Caldwell was called to the stand. The sound of his name drew murmurs through the room. When he entered, every person in the gallery rose to their feet, not because they were told to, but because respect demanded it. He wore his full dress uniform, ribbons and medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His presence alone seemed to silence the room's noise and tension. Chin approached him with the kind of respect reserved for heroes. "General Caldwell," he began softly, "please tell the court what happened that morning at the cafe." Caldwell's voice was calm, almost surgical in its precision. He described everything, from the first accusation to the final click of the handcuffs. There was no anger, no embellishment, just truth delivered with quiet strength. When Chin asked how it felt to be treated that way, the general paused. "I've been shot by enemies of this country," he said. "I've watched soldiers die in my arms. But I have never felt more violated than I did that morning, on American soil, by someone who swore the same oath I did, to protect and serve." Some in the audience began to cry quietly. The defense attorney stood, trying to find footing where there was none. Sullivan approached the stand cautiously, pretending at courtesy. "General Caldwell," he began, "would you agree that perhaps there was a misunderstanding? That Officer Cole, acting in the line of duty, may have misinterpreted your actions?" Caldwell turned his gaze on him, steady, unwavering, powerful. "Sir," he said, "when a decorated general in full uniform can't get a cup of coffee without being assaulted by police, that's not a misunderstanding. That's a system failure." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the judge's gavel barely restoring order. That single sentence would be replayed on every news network for weeks. Sullivan didn't ask another question. Over the next few days, the prosecution laid out its final evidence, the online messages between Cole and his network of extremist officers. The jury saw screenshots of group chats where they celebrated arrests of minorities and referred to them as undesirables. They saw code words, racist memes, even coordination between officers in different states. When the FBI's digital forensics expert explained that Cole's handle Blue Line 88 referenced neo-Nazi symbolism, Cole's head dropped for the first time. The man who once sneered with impunity now looked like someone staring into the mirror of his own destruction. Judge Watkins's disgust was barely concealed. "This isn't law enforcement," she said from the bench. "This is organized racial terrorism hiding behind badges." The defense tried to recover, calling character witnesses, former supervisors, fellow officers, but their testimonies fell apart under cross-examination. One by one, they admitted to knowing about Cole's behavior. One by one, they'd chosen silence. When closing arguments began, the entire country seemed to hold its breath. James Chun faced the jury with calm conviction. "This case isn't about one man's prejudice," he said. "It's about what happens when institutions protect it." Officer Cole wore the uniform of law enforcement, but he used it as armor for hate. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard the victims. You've seen the courage of a man who stood in dignity where others would have broken. Justice demands that you hold him accountable, not just for what he did, but for what he represented." He let the silence linger, then added softly, "Because if we can't hold this man accountable, then the uniform itself loses meaning." The defense, now desperate, leaned on pity. "Officer Cole has already suffered enough," Sullivan argued. "His reputation is gone, his career destroyed. Is there truly justice in sending another man to prison for the rest of his life?" When the jury retired to deliberate, hours turned into tension. Hayes watched from the back row, fingers pressed together. Chun sat beside him, eyes fixed on the courtroom door. For 6 hours, there was nothing but waiting. Then the bailiff entered. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone rose as the forewoman stood. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. "On all 47 counts, we find the defendant guilty." The air left the room. Some people cried openly. Others simply exhaled after holding their breath for days. Cole sat motionless, his pale hands gripping the table as if he could hold on to something that had already slipped away. Judge Watkins turned to him, her tone cold but resolute. "Ethan Cole, you are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Your actions were a betrayal of the public trust so profound, so rooted in hatred, that anything less would make a mockery of justice." There was no applause, no cheering, just silence. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the damage and the truth are finally visible in daylight. As guards led Cole away, Caldwell stood slowly in the gallery. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no triumph in Caldwell's expression, no vengeance. Only a deep sadness, not for the man himself, but for what he symbolized. Outside, the world was waiting. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and a crowd of veterans in uniform saluted as Caldwell exited the courthouse. He returned the salute, his movements deliberate, steady, unbroken. Agent Hayes approached him quietly. "You got him," he said. Caldwell shook his head. "No," he replied. We got him. But there are more out there." Hayes nodded. "Then we keep going." The general's gaze turned toward the horizon. A soldier once more, though his battlefield had changed. Justice had been served, but not finished. The system had taken its first step toward redemption. But redemption, Caldwell knew, wasn't a verdict. It was work. Constant, relentless, unending work. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and exhaustion, a quiet certainty stirred that maybe, just maybe this time, the truth had finally found a voice loud enough to be heard. The courtroom had gone quiet, but the echoes of justice carried far beyond its walls. The guilty verdict reverberated across the country like a long-delayed reckoning, shaking police departments, city halls, and state governments from complacency. What began as a single wrongful arrest in a small Raleigh cafe had become a national turning point. One that could no longer be dismissed as an isolated event or an unfortunate misunderstanding. For days, news networks replayed the footage of General Marcus Caldwell's press conference at the Pentagon, the one that had ignited a movement. In it, Caldwell had spoken not as a victim, but as a patriot demanding accountability. His words, calm, measured, resolute, struck something deep in the public conscience. A badge isn't immunity. It's a responsibility. Across the nation, those words became a rallying cry. Veterans, soldiers, students, and ordinary citizens took to the streets in coordinated demonstrations. They weren't riots or outbursts of rage. They were marches of unity, discipline, and moral purpose. Men and women in full uniform walked arm in arm with activists, clergy, and civil rights advocates. Placards read, "Respect the uniform," all of them, and "Justice wears no color." In front of the Raleigh Police Department, more than 10,000 people gathered in peaceful solidarity. General Patricia Hammond, Caldwell's commanding officer and the first to confront Officer Cole at the cafe, addressed the crowd through a megaphone, her voice carrying the conviction of a battlefield commander. "I didn't spend 27 years defending this nation's freedoms just to watch them violated on our own soil," she declared. "A man who wore the uniform of our army was treated like a criminal. That should shake every American to their core." Marcus Caldwell earned his stars through courage and sacrifice. Ethan Cole earned his badge through paperwork and prejudice. One of those men deserves our respect. The other deserves a cell. Her words rippled through the crowd like lightning, drawing tears, applause, and resolve. Within 48 hours, similar scenes unfolded in cities across America. From Chicago to Dallas, Los Angeles to New York, the movement spread. Veterans forming human chains to protect protesters, police officers kneeling beside them in apology, and citizens demanding systemic reform, not vengeance. The political world couldn't ignore it. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense James Morrison, a man known for avoiding controversy, took the podium in front of a wall of flags. His usual caution was gone. "When our soldiers can face enemies abroad, but not buy coffee at home without fear of harassment," he said, "then the problem is not public perception, it is public failure." He announced a sweeping Pentagon review of every recorded interaction between active or retired military personnel and civilian law enforcement. It was an unprecedented move, and one that carried a challenge. "We will be recommending legislation to ensure that those who wear the uniform of this nation and those who protect it at home are both held to the highest standard of accountability." The statement stunned the nation. Within hours, a bipartisan group of senators introduced what would later become the Uniform Service Protection Act, a law that would change the face of policing in America. The bill's sponsor, Senator Maria Gonzalez, stood on the Senate floor, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is for every parent who's watched their child serve with honor overseas, only to return home to suspicion and hate. This is for every veteran who's been treated as a threat because of their skin color. And this is for General Marcus Caldwell, and for every name we'll never know because they didn't survive their encounter." The bill passed with overwhelming support. It did more than add another line to the law books. It had teeth. It classified the false arrest of a military service member as a federal hate crime. It mandated bias and de-escalation training for every police department receiving federal funding. It created an independent review board to investigate complaints involving military personnel and civilians alike. Most controversially, it struck a blow at the long-standing shield of qualified immunity, making it possible for victims of abuse to hold officers personally accountable in court. The Uniform Service Protection Act was signed into law 6 months after Cole's sentencing. The signing ceremony was held in the White House Rose Garden, with veterans and lawmakers standing side by side. Cameras captured the moment when General Caldwell shook hands with President Morrison, a quiet exchange between two men who understood that progress, though fragile, was finally real. But Caldwell's work didn't end there. He could have retired quietly, taken his pension, moved away from the public eye, and tried to forget the humiliation he'd suffered. But that wasn't who he was. Instead, he turned his pain into purpose. He founded the Caldwell Foundation for Law Enforcement Reform, a nonprofit dedicated to transforming police culture from within. The foundation trained officers in cultural competency, implicit bias recognition, emotional regulation, and community-based policing. It worked with psychologists like Dr. Rachel Nguyen to overhaul screening systems, ensuring that candidates like Ethan Cole would never slip through the cracks again. At the Foundation's first symposium, Caldwell stood before a mixed audience of police officers, veterans, and civil rights leaders. His voice was steady, his uniform crisp, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to demonize every officer," he said. "I'm here to remind them that a badge is not a license. It's a responsibility. Authority without accountability is tyranny with a paycheck. Every oath, whether taken by a soldier or an officer, is sacred. And if we betray that oath, we betray the nation it stands for." The audience rose to their feet, not in applause, but in reverence. Over the next 2 years, More than 10,000 officers completed the Foundation's training programs. Cities that once resisted reform began implementing Caldwell's model. Departments introduced mentorship programs, pairing veteran officers with young recruits to rebuild trust from within. Internal affairs units, once seen as toothless, were restructured with civilian oversight. Meanwhile, the FBI and the Department of Justice launched Operation Clean Badge, using evidence from the Cole investigation to root out extremist networks within law enforcement. 43 departments were placed under federal review in the first year alone. Dozens of officers were indicted, and entire precincts were retrained under new leadership. The nation was far from healed, but for the first time in a long time, it was learning how to begin. On a quiet afternoon 2 years after the verdict, Nathan Hayes met Caldwell for coffee at the same Raleigh cafe where it had all begun. The old cafe had new owners now. The walls had been repainted, the air filled with the soft sound of jazz, and on one corner wall hung a brass plaque engraved with the words, "On this site, justice began again," in honor of General Marcus Caldwell and every person who stood for truth when silence was easier. Hayes smiled as he looked at it. "You know, General, not many people get to see the world change because of one moment." Caldwell chuckled softly. "It wasn't one moment, Agent Hayes. It was all of them. Every person who spoke out, every victim who refused to stay silent, every officer who decided that conscience mattered more than comfort. Change isn't a victory. It's a responsibility, the same as any oath." He paused, looking out the window as a group of young soldiers passed by in uniform, laughing and relaxed. "That's the real victory," he said quietly. "Not that Ethan Cole's in prison. Not that a law was passed. It's that maybe the next black general who walks into a cafe will just get his coffee in peace." Hayes nodded, his voice soft. "And the next cop who sees him won't see a threat." Caldwell smiled faintly. "Then maybe we're finally getting somewhere." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the hum of conversation filling the space around them. The world outside was still imperfect, still struggling, still learning, but for the first time in decades, it felt like progress had taken root. The road to justice was long, uneven, and endless. But as the afternoon sun spilled across the cafe's golden walls, General Marcus Caldwell knew this truth better than anyone. Real battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought at home, in hearts, in institutions, and in the courage to demand better from both. And that, he thought, was a war worth winning.